welcome back to the studio. You know, unless you've been living under a rock, you probably already know that retro gaming is making a huge comeback. So today, we're going to dive into something that I think perfectly captures that nostalgic charm, the Tiny Arcade Atari 2600. Now recently, I was browsing the internet and came across this little guy, and it was definitely an impulse purchase, but I figured if nothing else, it'll probably look great sitting on my desk. And it turns out, it's actually pretty cool. Now this little guy here shrinks down one of the most legendary gaming consoles of all time into a package with a tiny joystick, a minuscule display, and a tiny Atari 2600 console. But it's also packed with the classic games that we actually recognize. So is it just a novelty, or is it actually worth your time? Stick around and we'll break it down. Now, before we get into the details of this mini console, let's talk about why retro gaming is hotter than ever. Retro gaming is more than just a trend, it's a cultural phenomenon. Now, there's something about the simplicity of 8-bit graphics, the challenge of classic gameplay, and the nostalgia that takes us back to a simpler time. Now, whether you're someone who grew up with these games like I am, or a new gamer discovering them for the first time, there's definitely a magic to these pixelated adventures that modern games just can't replicate. Now, companies are tapping into this nostalgia by re-releasing mini versions of classic consoles, like the NES Classic, the Sega Genesis Mini, and of course, this tiny Atari 2600. But does this mini version live up to its legendary name? Let's find out. All right, so what do you actually get in the box with this thing? Well, you've got the little console itself with the reset button. You've got a tiny little joystick controller. It even has the little fire button on it. And you get this little retro looking TV with the display. Now the display actually lifts up so you can adjust the viewing angle on it, which is kind of nice. It is a small screen, but you can see that they've actually paid a little bit of attention to detail. I mean, it actually looks like a miniature Atari 2600, even has the wood grain design on the front of it. Now, it's small, but it's surprisingly functional. Now, the joystick obviously is absolutely tiny, but it's actually responsive and the buttons are, placed nicely. You can hold it in one hand and actually maneuver everything pretty good. It does have a built-in speaker that does a decent job, although it's not great. But let's talk about the most important part. The games. This little console comes preloaded with a selection of classic Atari 2600 titles. So you've got hits like Adventure, Missile Command, Centipede, Pac Man, and Asteroids. Now the games, they run surprisingly well. The emulation is pretty solid, with the original choppy frame rates and the quirky sound effects intact. Now, of course, the Atari 2600 games, they're pretty basic by today's standards, but that's part of the charm. Now, games like Adventure still hold up as fun and challenging, while Missile Command and Asteroids are perfect for quick gaming sessions. Now, Pac Man is still the disappointing version that I remember from the Atari 2600. So, the only downside? Not all Atari 2600 classics are included. Classic games like Pitfall or E.T. the Extraterrestrial, which I did a video on last week, now those are missing. But with the lineup that it does have, there's still plenty of fun to be had. Now let's talk about the controls. Now the joystick is tiny, like really tiny. Now if you've got big hands, you might find it a little bit awkward. But surprisingly, it's quite responsive, and it captures that classic Atari feel pretty well. Now the small screen makes it truly a portable Atari experience. But for long gaming sessions, you might find yourself wishing for a bigger display. Now, unfortunately, there's no HDMI output or anything like that, so you're stuck with the built-in screen. But, hey, that's part of the charm of a mini console like this. So, is the Tiny Arcade Atari 2600 worth picking up? Well, if you're a hardcore retro gaming fan, a collector, or just someone who loves the aesthetic of classic consoles, then sure, why not? It's a fun, nostalgic piece that looks great on display, and offers a solid selection of classic Atari games if you really want to play it. But if you're looking for a more in-depth retro gaming experience, you might be better off with something like the Atari Flashback or even an emulator. The tiny screen and the small joystick probably aren't for everyone. But as a fun little portable gaming fix, I think it does the job. At the end of the day, it's all about reliving those classic gaming memories. And for that, I think this little Atari delivers. So what do you think? Would you pick up the Tiny Arcade 2600 or something like it? Or do you think it's just pointless? Or do you prefer playing your retro games a different way? Let me know in the comments. Now, if you're interested in taking a closer look at this one yourself, I'll put a link in the video description below for you to check it out. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you don't miss out on more retro gaming goodness. Now, until next time, happy retro gaming!